Okay, so tonight we're going to have a chat about solar deities and try and increase increase some knowledge about that, but also capitalize on what you already know about these things when we have the conversation later. So solar deities, let's get started. It's a huge topic, as I was saying to Alison before we came on. I don't know, I've got this habit of picking topics I think I can put something together for that's interesting, and then suddenly realizing it is huge. So I had some choices to make, really. One was to either create some kind of general comments about solar deities and sun worship and sun religions, or to simply go through an A to Z of solar deities. And the A to Z of solar deities didn't seem to be that interesting to me, so I sort of cobbled together some ideas. And this is a wonderful quote from a book called The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall back in 1928. You may have come across the book. It's worth a quick read. He's trying to link loads of ideas of mysticism. He talks a lot about Freemasonry, amongst other things. But you can get his book free online from Sacred Texts if you want to chase it up. My starting point was this: why is the sun so important to cultures? And there's a forum called Quora, where lots of people post questions they want answered by pretend experts or real experts, depending on what you consider. And I just went through this forum and had a look at what people were talking about religion and talking about, why is the sun a god? And these are answers that came up on that forum from contemporary peoples, which I thought was really interesting. And if you look at one of the responses, if God is someone who gives us life, then the sun gives us life, therefore the sun is a god. One of the comments is great, that the closest thing to an actual God we have is the sun. It gives us life, and without the sun, life on earth wouldn't exist. And the one that the longer one from somebody who marked themselves anonymous, I think it was because they were concerned about whether some of their comments at the end would be jumped on by religious folks. But he says, now, if you say the sun is not a god, how can you say that Jesus and Allah are God? Jesus died 2,000 years ago and nobody's seen Allah. Muhammad died also died 1,400 years ago. The human race can't survive without it, can survive without its God, guys, but can't survive without the sun. So therefore the sun could be considered a god. So this is modern day people thinking, and therefore it stands to reason that old cultures would have looked into the sky, seen this thing moving across the sky, and given it some kind of importance. After all, it was the sun that brought the heat. It was the sun that went away and caused the cold. When the sun faded in some latitudes, it got colder. And so the sun was obviously seen as being important because sunlight helped life on Earth to grow. And that connection doesn't need a lot of intellectually thinking about it. I mean, we know now about the solar system and the sun and all that stuff, about heat transference, but people who observe nature, as these ancient cultures would have done, would have made these assumptions. And so therefore the sun obviously became really important. Now, there's a couple of existing ideas we need to take on board. Sun worship has often been interchangeable with the idea of pagans, and not modern pagans, but the pagans, people who aren't Christians, or pagans, people who live in the countries. And that sun worship is elevated to a position of being as if it's quite common. In fact, it's relatively rare. And that's the first thing that's a bit of a shock, perhaps. In fact, solar religions, although a lot of cultures use solar symbolism or motifs, there are only a few cultures that really took on solar religion: the Egyptians, the Indo-Europeans, and the Mesoamericans, and that's the South Americans as well. Those are the cultures that really developed a very powerful solar religion, whereas solar motifs and ideas came into other religions. And the thing that's in common with all of these is that they had a well-developed urban civilization with a strong ideology of sacred kingship, And of course, the sun became synonymous with the ruler of, of the land. So the sun in the sky became synonymous with the power of the king, which is kind of interesting. And so we're going to explore some of this in detail. And then the other idea is that solar deity is often thought of being male and lunar being female, but the opposite is more often the case, which is rather odd in modern pagan circles. Certainly in Wicca and stuff, you have the idea of the sun god and the lunar goddess. But in fact, in cultural terms, there are as many, if not more, solar goddesses than there are solar gods. For example, and this is where I started to go down this list of goddesses, and I thought I'll just put them up here for you to look at. But Australia native traditions have two solar goddesses. Indian tribal religions have a number of solar goddesses. Sri Lanka has a solar goddess. The American First Nations people have solar goddesses. The Inuit have a solar goddess. The Japanese have a solar goddess called Amaterasu. These are part of the deities that are worshipped in these traditions. The European sun goddess would include Sule for the Lithuanians and Latvians. The Finns have Pavata and Beyu. The German Sunna and the Norse Sol is feminine. And the Sami have Bevi and also Sol, which is also feminine. So these are solar goddesses. If you look at Egyptian deities, the motif that appears quite a lot is the cobra, the lioness, and the cow. Well, actually, the cobra was the female goddess Wadjet or Buto, the cow was the female goddess Athor, and the lioness was the female goddess Sekhmet. And so these goddesses, which could seem to be solar, notice the orb in two of the pictures, they are solar goddesses. In insular Celtic countries, now insular Celtic countries are those non-European cultures that would include Brittany. So the 6 regions on this map here, they are known as insular Celtic because of the language structures, but they have several goddesses that are solar in nature. The Irish name for the sun is Grian, which is feminine, and Ain is sometimes seen as another name for her, but it's more often related to being her sister. And in certain Celtic traditions, you have the idea of the summer sun being Ain and the winter sun being Gran, the sun having two different aspects. Etain, and in fact, there's a famous story, the wooing of Etain is a very powerful Celtic story, but she is a goddess that's associated with the sun. And if she's associated with the sun, then it is quite likely, because of various connections, that Epona may have originally been solar in nature, but the Romans decided, their mixing of religions pushed towards a lunar role. Sulis, we mentioned her earlier down in Bath. She has connections with the Greek Helios and the Indian Soraya, and bears the same solar traits, particularly in association with the eye and all that kind of stuff, and light. A possible synonym or theonym, because it's a god, Saliva, she is often seen to be related to Sulis, but she probably isn't. But she is a pan-Celtic solar goddess. So it's quite interesting. And if we go a bit further, and it won't get any deeper than this, I promise, in terms of philosophy, but the solar sun in ancient traditions were observed to have a trinity. As Manly Hall notes, that the sun is just not a symbol of light, but has 3 phases: rising, midday, and setting. And it was quite sensible for people to start looking at these 3 stages of the sun to represent 3 stages of life, or 3 stages of development, or 3 stages of purity. In fact, certain mystics, particularly Rosicrucians and people going further back than that, said that each solar system had 3 suns. But the idea wasn't there were 3 physical suns. They were a spiritual sun, an intellectual sun, and a solar sun. That's spelt correctly. It's not solar as in solar sun. It's solar as in the soul, and a material sun. And so people started to see this division of soul, spirit, and body, mind, body, and spirit, as being represented by the three stations of the sun, which I think is really interesting, especially when you look at Christian mythology. We'll come to that later. So the sun not only passes through the sky, it has three distinct phases to it. It brings life to Earth, but a number of deities associated with the sun were feminine, not masculine, and it may well be the rise of certain Roman ideas that started to put many of the female goddesses of the sun, solar goddesses, out of the limelight, as it were, and start to foreground their own solar gods. So the Egyptians, as we know, has been said earlier, the sun for the Egyptians was a symbol of immortality. If you think about that Trinity idea, it rose in the morning, went to midday, descended at night, and then came back the next morning. So three stages of life: birth, middle age, death. Something happens and there's rebirth. So the sun was seen as the journey of a spiritual soul, if you like, or the journey of life. But they also noticed the sun doesn't just have this day-night movement, it actually travels through the 12 houses of the zodiac. And astrology, goes back to the Egyptians and to the Babylonians. And so it's quite important to recognize this. And one of the things that we possibly forget modern days is that whereas the planets was known as wanderers, the signs were seen as fixed, and the fixed signs, Taurus, Aries, Aquarius, and those stations were, if you like, they were the themes that the wanderers, the planets, move through to create meaning. So when the sun is seen to move through the 12 houses, the sun illuminates the aspects of those 12 houses, those 12 signs. I tend to think of astrology as a metaphor for growth and evolution, rather than I was born Aries and that's it. So the Egyptians really pulled some of this together into a more coherent set of ideology. But of course, they got their ideas from the Sumerians and the Babylonians and all of those earlier tribes that are worth thinking about. The most important solar deity, as far as Egyptians were concerned, was Ra. He was the king of deities, and the father of all creation. He was the patron of Egypt, basically. And it was not only that Ra governed the movements of the sun, but the sun was also Ra, which is why he's depicted often in these hieroglyphics as the circle, the bright circle of light. But Ra is really interesting because the Egyptians didn't just believe in Ra, they knew that the spirit of the sun, the spirit of Ra, could actually amalgamate with other deities to bring power to those deities. So when Amun, who was the unknowable creator deity, and Ra combined, they became Amun-Ra. And Amun-Ra represented the raw universal power of the sun. When Ra sort of joined in with Horus, it became Ra-Horakhti, and the Ra-Horus in the horizon, representing Ra in human form, which is what the pharaohs did. When Ra was paired with the Aten was the disk of the sun, the rays of one, then you had Aten-Ra. And it's really interesting that Aten appears in the Old Kingdom text, meaning discs, and the moon was sometimes called the silver Aten, which I really like the idea. But Aten-Ra has a different characteristics. Notice, of course, Ra is the consistent energy, and the others are the personifications of that energy. Ra could also take the guise of Sekhmet and Hathor. So when Sekhmet and Hathor are depicted with spheres above their heads, that's because they have the Ra-ness about them, if that makes any sense. So Sekhmet's quite a fierce character, and Hathor was a loving character. These two together are very powerful deities, but they're solar deities. Ra, of course, in its purest form, represented the Egyptian cosmos, and the sun moved through the sky, pushed by the beetle Kefri, and then brought the sun back to the underworld on a magical through the underworld on a magical barge. And now Kefri is the dung beetle, basically, and you'll often see the beetle being is a really important symbol on Egyptian cartouche, but also the images of the dung beetle rolling the dung was like a material representation of the Kefri, the cosmic beetle, rolling the sun across the sky. And of course, because the Egyptians was an agricultural um, community culture, without the sun, then they wouldn't have had their crops. And so the movement of the sun would have actually been essential for them connecting with the growth of their crops. Now, the Nile that flows through Egypt, if you look at a picture of the Nile, then from space, even today, you'll see that either side of the Nile there's a green area, and then very quickly it goes into the desert area. Egypt could only develop along the Nile, where the water brought floods to the parts of the land, and that soil there became fertile for growing. Of course, the sun dried the water away to make the soil fertile to bring the crops. The preeminent kind of religion, if you like, in early Egypt was Amunism. I think I've invented that, but it's really that the god Amun and Amunet, the goddess, are mentioned in the earlier pyramid texts. Amun, as we said, means invisible or hidden one, and he rose to power as the guardian deity of Thebes, the Egyptian capital, during the 11th dynasty, and as patron with him and his wife. Amun was the father, Mut was the mother, and the moon god Khonshu formed a divine Theban triad, that's triplicity again, and they were known as the Theban triad. And this was the standard religion in Egypt for a long time, around which everything else developed. And the cult of Amun grew in importance and eventually became the chief deity who was worshipped during that period, and it was the sun god Ra. And the Amun Ra brought the two together, so it was that duality, if you like. In the pyramid texts, there's you can find a hymn to Amun Ra, and he is called the Lord of Truth, Father of the gods, Maker of men, Creator of all animals, Lord of all things, that are Creator of and that are Creator and the staff of life. So this was truly a solar religion, in the sense that it had raised this solar deity to supreme godhood. Remember, of course, that the Egyptians were polytheistic, if that's the right phrase to use, having several gods and several deities. And like the Sumerians before them, cities would have had patron gods and goddesses. We can't talk about this without coming on to this thing called Atonism, or the Amana heresy. You see, whilst Amun-Ra was the dominant deity amongst the pantheon of Egyptian gods, around about 1300 BC, Amenhotep IV came to power, and he decided that he wanted to do away with the multitude of gods and raise the Aten to the status of supreme god. Remember, the Aten was the solar disk, and in the start of his reign, he allowed other gods to be worshipped. He then changed his name to Ankhen-Aten, spirit of the Aten, as evidence of his new worship, and later forbade the worship of other gods, which was a radical departure for centuries of religious practice. In fact, Atonism is quite an interesting area to study, because he wanted to move the capital of Egypt from Thebes to Amarna, a place in the desert which was going to be dedicated to the Aten, and he and his wife Nefertiti would actually start to worship the Aten. They became the priests of the Aten, and for a number of years, this became the official religion of Egypt. Now, you just got to stop and think about this for a minute, because if for centuries there have been multiple gods, and Amun-Ra being the main deity, but multiple gods, there were priests to Amun-Ra, there were temples to Amun-Ra, there were temples to the other gods and goddesses, all of which need servicing. So the people that Akhenaten actually miffed off, if you like, would have been the priests that were earning the money for the tributes to the temple. So the priests were suddenly out of a job, and they were not very happy about this. They really weren't. One of the key features of Atenism was the ban on idols and other images of the Aten, with the exception of the raid disc, which you can see in the hieroglyph there. And in many ways, Atenism was monotheistic. It took away all the other gods and raised it to one solar god, whose rays of light and life were bestowed upon Nefertiti and Akhenaten, who then bestowed on the people. And you can find in the text that survive something called the Great Hymn to Aten, whose sole god beside whom there is none. This really is monotheistic. From the 9th year of Pharaoh's rule, they stopped using Aten as a symbol and started to insist that the name of Aten was spelt phonetically. So images of the Aten were getting less and less. When Akhenaten died, his successor Semkari survived for 2 years and carried on the idea. When Semkari died, Nefertiti took the throne for a brief period. We don't know what happened, what she did. We don't know much about her. But after her death, Akhenaten's 9-year-old son, Tutankhaten, succeeded her. And at the beginning of his reign, this young pharaoh, probably pressured by the older priests and the people who were his vizier or whatever, started to reverse Atenism and started to re-establish the old polytheistic religion, and he named himself Tutankhamun. His wife and sister then was then named herself Anaxanamun, and the worship of the Aten ceased for the most part of the worship of Amun-Ra was restored. So this brief period of Atenism was quite powerful at the time for what it did, but also was, shall we say, pushed back and crushed very quickly upon his death, when his son, Tutankhamun, actually moved the capital from Amarna back to Thebes, and actually Amarna was torn down. And shortly after Tutankhamun's death, Horemheb, the pharaoh that took over from Tutankhamun, insisted that Akhenaten's name was struck from Egyptian records. All religious and governmental changes were undone, and the capital was returned to Thebes. The previous patron deities were restored, but there was systematic destruction, disfiguration of the Aten sculptures and even the statues of Akhenaten, almost as if they wanted to drive memory of this monotheistic religion out of history. Whilst the Chinese were not solar religions as such, Chinese cosmology has quite a lovely tale about the sun, which I just thought I'd share here. There are initially, according to certain Chinese cosmologies, 10 suns in the sky who are all brothers. And they were supposed to emerge one at a time as commanded by the Jade Emperor. but they had a sort of foolish side to themselves, a jokey side to themselves. So they all decided to go out into the sky at one time and play. And that made the world too hot for anything to grow. So a hero named Hu Yi, who is still actually venerated in China, shot down 9 of the suns with a bow and arrow to save the people of the earth, leaving just one sun in the sky. So I mean, this is about solar deities, but also human beings being able to control solar deities, and maybe there's an interesting message there. In Aztec mythology, sort of South American, we do have a key solar deity called Tanith. His name literally means moving to the sun. Now, Aztecs were really interesting in the sense that they believed that there were phases of time, which is what all that stuff about 2012 was all about, the end of the Mayan calendars and all that kind of stuff. And each period of time, each Bacton, they would have had a different sun. So this sun, the Tanath sun, was still in his hera, and therefore still subject to whatever this particular god was moving across the sky is directing for us. But notice here that this kind of Aztec mythology and indeed certainly the Egyptian mythologies are very old. They're sort of, and these were societies that were very well structured. And so having a solar religion made a kind of sense. Mithraism, or the Mithras cult, is also worth mentioning here. Mithra is actually a god from Zoroastrian divinities, in fact called Yazata. And he is not the same god that the Mithras cult worshipped, although there are links. Now, the Mithras cult was quite interesting because when we start to talk about Christmas or other things like that, you often see that Jesus has the same story as Mithra, the sun god Mithra, and that's not particularly true, but it's really interesting because people have conflated the Zoroastrian divinity with the Roman divinity and made a story. But the Mithras cult was really interesting. We only know about the Mithras cult from the reliefs and sculptures that have been left, and then we have to interpret the material, and that's the problem with a lot of this stuff. We have to look back at how we're going to interpret the material based upon our own pre-existing knowledge or lack of knowledge of these cultures. But one of the key features in the Mithras cult was of the god Mithra murdering or slaughtering a white bull. Interestingly, that murdering of the bull is actually familiar in Celtic cultures too, and one wonders about the links there. Mithra is linked to Sol, and we also have depictions of Mithras' birth from a rock. He was said to be given birth by a rock. No time to go into that, but if you want to look it up, you can. But there are no first-hand accounts of Mithra's activities. It is clear that there were numerous sites for Mithra worship in Rome, and they're associated with fasting, and they found in these sites food residues which suggest that, feasting, not fasting, that they had major feasts. And some of these animal bones are also found to be with large quantities of fruits residues. And there's a presence of large amounts of cherry stones, which tends to suggest that midsummer, late June, early July, is the season that's associated with Mithraic festivals. There's a link here to solstices and stuff. Very interesting, Mithra. We know that the temples of Mithra are sunk underground, which for a solar religion is really interesting. Numerous have been excavated, like this one here in Italy. they weren't actually evenly distributed. They were spread out sort of in a haphazard way, which kind of suggests that there was no central control of Mithra temples, that they just grew up where they needed to grow up. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that right underneath the Vatican, Vatican was built upon Mithra temples, which some conspiracy theorists make the link between Mithras is really what the church is worshipping rather than Jesus. Another story. Um, what we do know about Mithras from various sources is there were 7 degrees of initiation into the cult. And these are they there. I'm not going to go through them all, but notice, of course, 7 is an important number because 7 links the 7 planets at the time, or the 7 classical planets. What I find is really interesting, and those of you who are into other forms of revival cult groups or occult groups may like to consider this as in terms of other kinds of initiation ceremonies, but their way of welcoming each other was a handshake, which I find that's why that should be singled out as an important thing. But the idea of the handshake is that what we do know about the Mithra cult is that they actually didn't like their hands to become sullied by blood or by any other degrading activity. So the shaking of pure hands with the Mithras people was quite important. Notice though that we have handshakes, a symbol of many secret societies, which I find kind of interesting. Maybe that's kind of led on a bit. The other thing about this is, if you know anything about Freemasonry, you may recognize some interesting things in there. Again, there's a suggestion that they've evolved into things or stolen or borrowed from these traditions. The thing about their hands needing to be clean or unsullied or not drenched in blood or whatever presents a certain challenge, because we do know that Roman soldiery were actually worshippers of Mithra. So how they managed to keep their hands clean of being soiled, one does not know. But we'll leave that for you to think about. We must also mention this idea of Sol Invictus, another character. Sol Invictus is the unconquered sun, which is known from the Roman Empire. And for many years, the idea of Sol Invictus was the idea that this was actually a religion, a solar deity that spawned a religion. However, modern scholars that I've been reading suggest that Sol Invictus is really one of 2 solar gods in Rome. The other one was Sol Indiges. It was the early Sol, minor importance, and it seems that Sol Indiges, the one that died out, was replaced by Sol Invictus, who was a Syrian sun god. And actually, the cult of Sol Invictus tried to become established by Pope Elgabalus. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my words tonight. But 50 years later, the Emperor Aurelian actually did set up a Sol Invictus as the official religion alongside traditional Roman cults. Again, notice the date, the 25th of December. There's all this kind of circumstantial stuff that points to these being the forerunners of the Christ character of Christianity. But I couldn't go too far without talking about Sol Invictus. Again, a solar cult rather than necessarily a religion. Which brings us to the question, is Jesus a solar deity? And I do think that's something for another time, but there are some interesting overlaps, I've said. And one of the things I found really interesting, often Catholic priests in particular will hold up something called a moonstrance. And a moonstrance is an artifact, and you can see pictures here, and don't they look like the radiant suns? Yeah, the moonstrance actually is the way that the communion wafer or any holy relic would actually carried around there. So in the center of that circle, in the center of, shall I say, the sun, the holy relic would actually sit, and also the communion wafer would sit, the blessed communion wafer. And it's really interesting for me, just image wise, how those are so striking. And in particular in Catholicism, the idea that the wafer, the communion wafer, indeed the communion wine, the transubstantiation says it starts off as bread and wine, but during the ritual it becomes the body and the blood of Christ, after which point it is sacred and is therefore carried around in a sun. But we'll explore that later. So the importance of the sun in many respects is really that it's there and it's supportive of life. What is also interesting is a lot of religions, a lot of places had solar deities, I'll rephrase that. Um, it, the sun was the reflector of the source of power and not the source of power. So often you will see motifs of the sun carried on shields, again a reflector. There's that wonderful story of the Emperor Constantine being told to polish his shields to defeat the armies, so the sun would reflect in his shields. And I think when we look at this, the god as as sun as a motif, we can find it everywhere. But as a solar religion, it's very restrictive. There are a couple of images, and we're getting close to the end now, as you might be relieved to know, but there are a couple of ideas that I think are really important. One is the sun barge. Now, Ra was said to travel through the sky on a sun barge, providing light to the world. Each 12th of his journey formed one of the 12 Egyptian hours of the day, and he was overseen by a protective deity. So there is a picture of Ra in the boat with the sun above his head, traveling towards the night sky. And obviously passing through the night sky, traveling into the underworld while fending off first destructive monsters for another 12 hours or whatever they were, and reappearing on the eastern horizon. The movement of the sun using some kind of conveyance is a repeating solar theme. In Egypt, we've got the sun barge. Interestingly, outside Abydos in Egypt, they've discovered a number, I think it's in the dozens, of sort of barges buried in the sand, all pointing towards the Nile. And these were said to be the pharaoh's sun barges that were representative of his journey beyond the afterlife. But we have solar chariots in Hindu mythology. Surya is driven across the sky in her chariot, and the sky there is illuminated by her passing. There are so many connections and links to the movement of deities through the cosmos on chariots and barges that they exist in almost every mythical story we can tell. I don't do yoga, but the morning ritual of Surya Namaskar is what yogis perform as the sun salute to the sun, and in those traditions, it's done every morning as a waking up. Did you ever do salute to the sun? Yeah, Sue did yoga, and you did the salute to the sun with your down dog and backward dog and all those things that are there. But those gestures are really about welcoming life into the body and welcoming the sun to give you life in the body. Yeah, through your breath. There we go. Interesting stuff. Now, the last few slides I just decided I'd put together because I just want to get you intrigued. The next few slides are recognition that the sun must have been important to ancient traditions because we have all this archaeological stuff. So, and these are in chronological order as best as I can make it. So what you're looking at here is a statue with a sun on it, dated during the Copper Age, Bronze Age, discovered in Avignon. It's probably one of the earliest artifacts that have this sort of solar connection to it. We then, of course, come to Newgrange, which was built around 3200 BC, with its alignments. its solstice alignments. Again, this particular structure, as with those at Nouth, with all the carvings on there about the same kind of time, show us that there was something going on with the Celts in terms of their connections to the sun. Interestingly, you probably know this, but I didn't until I read it a bit. But until we went there, actually boasting because we've been there and we've been down the channel. But that sort of rather garish limestone front is not original. That was put there during the sort of tidying up of the site. It's very stunning, and it's stunning in the moonlight as well. But anyway, that's another story. But again, the alignments in these places like this across the insular Celtic world are solar alignments. Yeah. Of course, Stonehenge, which was built a little bit later, this is one of the later phases of the buildings, but Stonehenge, the solar alignments there are well documented. So for the effort that went into building these places, and in some ways solar temples, possibly in the case of Newgrange, in the case of Stonehenge, these were, shall we say, raised to celebrate death and the light that comes into death. But that we'll talk about that another time, perhaps. But I just think it's really interesting. And then we come on to, it surprises a lot of people. Stonehenge was built before the pyramids, because the first pyramid was built around 2700 BC, and it's King Dozer's pyramid. Not a very, immediately not an impressive pyramid, built by Imhotep, but that was the very first pyramid, and we know that the pyramids had alignments, and the pyramids actually have a solar connection. The later pyramids, the pyramids of Cheops, which were also solar aligned. The rings of Brodgar on the Orkneys, they have solar alignments built about 2,500 years ago. Well, actually more than that, 4,500 years ago, because I keep forgetting to add the 2,000 years we've been living. And then, of course, the pyramid of Cheops, or Khufu, I should say. Again, built with solar alignments and astronomical alignments. Clearly, what's going on in the sky is really important to these people. I included this because I really love it. This is the Nebra sky disk. Not only did it kind of have an appearance on the Midsummer Murders, but the Nebra sky disk, about 1600 BCE, it's beautiful. And you can see that there. The symbols are interpreted as being the full moon, perhaps possibly eclipsed moon, and there are some other symbols we'll talk about in a moment, and then the 7 dots possibly being 7 stars of Pleiades. The interesting thing about this disc, when it was discovered, it was found by two metal detector bods who were in place they shouldn't have been, where it was illegal to be, and they came across this and some Bronze Age swords as a treasure trove, and they knew they couldn't sell them publicly because they'd be in trouble, and so they sold them to a dealer who eventually grasped them up, and they got locked up for it. They then tried to appeal their sentence for being locked up and got even longer on the appeal because they'd actually damaged this thing. If you look at this symbol around the edge, they cut into it with a spade as they were digging it up. And also because they'd taken it out of the ground, they'd taken it out of any archaeological context. And so really the find is very difficult to date, but rather beautiful. What we do know about it, because initially people thought it may have been a fake, and now the consensus generally isn't a fake. But initially the disc was, as you see there, a circular plate with the sun or full moon, crescent moon, or the sun and moon undergoing eclipse, and the 7 Pleiades. That's how it existed initially. But then at a later date, 2 arcs were actually put onto the plate on the left and the right there. And what it was discovered was those arcs span an angle of 82 degrees, which is the positions of the sunset, the summer and winter solstice at a specific latitude close to where this was found, which I think is fascinating. So here we've got an astronomical device that actually allows you to be carried around to measure the solstices and equinoxes. And then the next phase was the addition of what has been interpreted as a sunboat, again at the bottom there, um, again um, showing us the importance of this idea of the solar barge. And then I think coming up to final bits really, this rather beautiful sort of artifact from Denmark, Bronze Age, about 1400 BC. It's the sun being pulled by a horse on a chariot. It is absolutely beautiful. It's not overly big, 54 centimeters by 35 centimeters, but the one side of the disc is gold plated. And what I haven't got to show you here is the other side of the disc, which is uh, not plated at all, so it's black. So you have a shiny golden side and you have a black side. And again, I think it's rather beautiful sculpture. These things, these artifacts, you know, you've got to have a settled culture, and you've got to have a culture that can organize itself to build things like Stonehenge, Newgrange, the pyramids, and you've got to have an artistic uh, group of people who can construct things like the sky disk and things like this. So again, if the sun is the motive in these, or the motif in these, then it's clear that the sun is vitally important to these peoples. So, kind of summary thoughts. In that early societies were primarily agricultural and they depended on the sun for life and sustenance, it's no surprise that the sun became deified, and in some cases, solar religions developed. We know that many cultures, uh, plains peoples of North America, the Chinese, the Mayan cultures, they all have a recognition of the sun being a life-giving force, and drove certain practices about life and death. We know, for example, the Mayans and the Incas had were not averse to sacrificing to their deities. There's evidence that the Celts sacrificed, and many of these societies would have seen life and death as part of the cycle of the rebirth of the sun. And in Mithra, the Persian Zoroastrian version of Mithra, um, the Persians would have celebrated the rising of the sun each day, as indeed Hinduism follows of many other religions. Obviously, the sun uh, was recognized as being important because people spent time looking at it enough to create observatories like Stonehenge, alignments like Brodgar and Newgrange, and to wonder at the nature of life. The Romans honored this time as sacred to Juno, wife of Jupiter and goddess of women in childbirth. Her name gives us the month of June, which is kind of nice because June then is actually when we have the solstice. And to finish off, there's this really kind of nice image here that in pagan traditions, European traditions, there's this wonderful idea of rolling fiery things down hills. So barrel rolling is related to the sun, a fiery disc spinning, and there are traditions in certain parts of Europe where these fiery wheels or barrels were rolled into water, which gives us a rather interesting idea about the importance of water and the sun together, and the fact that you need to honor both. And that's certainly something the Egyptians knew from the flooding of the Nile and its requirement for the sun to drive that process. And I think that's it. Next time, we're going to look at past lives and past life regression. So I hope you're going to find that interesting. I find this interesting, and we'll stop it there and we'll come back to having a chat.